Try to picture a world where everything you know has been unjustly taken from you. You've been separated from your family and your friends. You no longer have your job or your life or the things that you like to do every day. You're hundreds, thousands of miles away from where you were born. What would you do to go home? How far would you go? On a clear night in July of 1839, 53 slaves aboard the Amistad slave ship decided that enough was enough and they were going to do whatever it took to go home. In the last episode, we described the horrible conditions that the Amistad slaves endured when they crossed the Atlantic Ocean during what was called the Middle Passage. And once the slaves arrived in their destination, they would often be shipped to other islands or other localities where they could be used as plantation workers. So oftentimes slaves would have to endure another journey in a ship where they were tightly packed together and, basically another slave ship. This is exactly what the Amistad slaves were doing when they found themselves on board the Amistad. They were being transported to another area in the Caribbean where they could be used as slaves. The ship, ironically enough, was named for friendship, and it contained 53 slaves and only 7 crew members. So it was a much smaller vessel than a typical big slave ship that would carry hundreds of slaves across the Middle Passage. The vessel carried all sorts of plantation items, from trade goods to food to the slaves themselves to plantation equipment, even a variety of different national flags to hoist up in the event where they had to pretend they were one country or another, depending on what type of policing force they ran into, because remember, the slave trade was in large part illegal at this time. The 53 slaves on board suffered very similar conditions to what they had previously gone through with the Middle Passage. They had little food to eat. They were often chained below the decks in very small space. Oftentimes they were chained on the decks, which could sometimes be even worse because the sunlight and the conditions of whatever the weather was that day could be devastating to someone chained on the deck. Beatings and floggings were considered normal. If any of the slaves asked for more water, or God forbid they stole more water than the basically half a cup they were given per day, oftentimes bad things could happen. Here's Cinque, probably the leader of the revolt, talking about it. Quote, "He was held down by 4 sailors and beaten on the back many times by another sailor with a whip having several lashes." End quote. So this person was trying to get extra water, and similar to what we saw with the Middle Passage, there was a lot of floggings, beatings, and terror inflicted upon the slaves. Slave ships like this often had a cook on board with kind of like a full-service kitchen, and the cook on the ship, a guy by the name of Celestino, he was often one who beat and terrorized the slaves even more so than the other crew members. So he would often intimidate the slaves with beatings and whippings and then gesture to them in kind of menacing ways that eventually they were going to be killed. So the Amistad slaves were terrified of this Celestino guy, the cook on the ship. It was said that he came up with a special contraption of salt, rum, and gunpowder, which he would mix together and pour on the wounds of slaves after these beatings, and you can just imagine the type of pain that would put a person in. And you can also imagine the type of tension that this would put on the slaves and on really the crew members of the ship as well. So you got to keep in mind that the crew members were vastly outnumbered. There was only 7 crew members on this slave ship and 53 slaves. So it was thought that the dangerous part of the whole slave ship operation was the loading and unloading part, which we talked about last time. It was kind of thought that once they were on the ship, they'd be easier to control. Obviously, that wouldn't be the case here. The slaves got together in the hold of the ship, and collectively they decided that a mutiny was going to happen, led by Cinque, who we talked about earlier. Cinque would find a loose nail and use that to pick the lock on his chains. Once he was free, he was able to pick the locks of other slaves, and they waited until nighttime. Once nightfall hit, the slaves snuck up onto the deck. The first person they took care of was the cook, remember, who had been threatening them and menacing them and whipping them before, and they used some of his weapons and some of his clubs to just club him to death while he was sleeping. After this, they were able to locate some machetes, and the rebellion was on. So the battle raged on the deck of the ship. The captain of the ship fought back bravely, killing 2 slaves before being himself injured and killed. Once the rest of the crew realized it was over, 2 would jump overboard. Eventually they would swim to safety and alert other people about the rebellion. 2 others would be killed, and then the remaining 3 crew members would be taken captive. The slaves, who were all free at this point, now had a bit of a debate as to whether or not they were going to kill the 3 remaining crew members. Their names were Montes, Ruiz, and Antonio. On the one hand, revenge sounded like a pretty sweet dish to be served to the slave masters, but on the other hand, none of these slaves actually knew how to operate a ship. And sailing these old school boats is a lot more difficult than it might seem. Ultimately, the peace faction is going to win out, and the Spanish crew members would be used to try and sail the ship back to Africa, because these men wanted to go home. For 6 weeks, the slaves would sail and wonder why they didn't seem to be making any progress towards Africa. The reason for this was Montes, one of the Spanish sailors, was a former captain himself, and he was executing a bit of a treacherous plan. So by day, Montes would sail the ship east, slowly, against the wind, and he'd make sure the progress was slow. And by night, he would steer the ship and double it back north and west, hoping to run into some other ship that might free them, or run into land somewhere where he might be freed as well. So by day, he was going east. By night, he was going north and west, hoping to trick the slaves. As the weeks are going by, the ship is running out of food and water and supplies, and they try to resupply by land or by other vessel, but ultimately they get scared of being recaptured and they don't get the supplies they need. Eventually, everybody realizes that they're probably close to the United States, and it's probably in the best interest of everyone to find a landing spot there. For Montes, Ruiz, and Antonio, they might have a chance to get their ship back if the authorities agree with them, and for the slaves, they had been assured that the United States is not a slave country, which in the North was true. So both sides take the gamble, and the Amistad slave ship lands near Montauk Point in Long Island. A handful of slaves went out to negotiate with the white men they found there. While they were doing that, their vessel ends up getting captured by a U.S. Navy ship. The U.S. Navy would then send out a boat to capture the slaves who were originally on the island to negotiate, and all of a sudden, the Amistad slave ship is captured by the United States Navy. The captain of that ship decides, we're going to tow this thing back to Connecticut, where slavery is still legal, and we're going to hope to claim salvage rights. So basically the idea is that we found this ship and some of the property on it can now be ours. In what must have seemed like a blink of an eye to the slaves, they were now back in another jail, this time in the United States, and just when they thought their battle for freedom was over and won, it turned out it was just beginning. Very quickly, the Amistad slaves are placed in front of a judge, and it's determined that they will be charged for piracy and murder. This is on September 17th, 1839, so a couple months after the rebellion. They were placed in what was called New Haven Jail in some pretty bad conditions. So 9 to 10 slaves would die early in the jailing process from either white flux or dehydration or maybe an illness that they had already gotten aboard the Amistad slave ship, and you can see why. Here's historian Marcus Rediker discussing the situation at the New Haven jail. Quote, "To make matters worse, the jail shared features of the slave ship beyond the brute fact of incarceration. Not the least of these was the pungent smell of bondage. A visitor wrote that the rooms occupied by the Africans are infected with the odor peculiar to jails that are badly ventilated, or not ventilated at all. The stench was almost insupportable. A main reason why were the necessary tubs, which were public and located in the eating and sleeping rooms. The 4 children were jammed into a single bed, the men slept on straw amid vermin, and the food was poor in quality." End quote. So remember, there's 4 teenage girls and younger that are among the Amistad slaves, so they're going through this just as much as the adults. And you have to feel for the slaves here, because they must just be thinking to themselves, here we go again. They came so close to getting that freedom and going home, only to be stuck in conditions that have to remind you of the horrors of the Middle Passage. The only way out of this for the Amistad slaves was to win in the courtroom. And in order to do that, they had to find some way to communicate their story to the people who would be defending them. So remember that they were speaking a language that almost no one in this section of Connecticut spoke. So it took a while for kind of the defense team to find some sort of translators that could make sense of the story that the Africans were able to tell. Ultimately, they would be able to find those translators, and very quickly, the story of the Amistad slaves began to be told, not just in the jailhouse, but also locally in the local newspapers, and it even started to get some national press, and it really became something that captivated the nation. The New Haven jail became a type of public meeting house where different groups could come together and meet with the Africans, and it became sort of a place where alliances could be made. Hundreds, sometimes even thousands of visitors per day could come and see the story for themselves. High-profile visitors like former President John Quincy Adams would visit the Amistad slaves. This kind of demonstrates how big a deal this was throughout the country and how high-profile it was becoming. The Amistad slaves actually wrote John Quincy Adams a letter after he visited them, and they were kind of pleading for his help, his assistance, and they invoked the golden rule. So they asked him, "Hey, John Quincy Adams, how would you feel if you were taken from your home? How would you feel if your sons and your daughters and your family were suddenly taken from you and you were shipped to Africa? How would that feel for you?" Methods like this were effective for the Amistad Africans in getting their story told and getting the American public on their side, which they needed to do to help win in the courtroom. In the local courtroom, the piracy and murder charges are thrown out pretty quickly. So none of the judges that the Amistad slaves would see would take this very seriously. The issue in the courtroom was, are these slaves property? And if they are property, whose property are they? You have to keep in mind that this is 1840 in America, where slavery is a very hot-button issue, and the road to the Civil War is slowly paving itself. So there are some huge questions to be answered that are going to have big ramifications, not just for the Amistad slaves, but for the country as a whole. Is the United States judicial system going to rule that slaves are indeed property? Is that going to be an official ruling? Are they going to rule that it's somehow just for slaves to overthrow their masters? I mean, can you imagine what Southern plantation owners are thinking if all of a sudden the American court system decides that slaves have the legal right to overthrow their masters? So this becomes a huge, contentious, and polarized issue, and you can see why. Ultimately, the local judge would rule in favor of the Africans, saying that, quote, each of them are natives of Africa, and were born free, and ever since have been, and still of right, are free and not slaves, end quote. It looks like the Amistad slaves are free and in the clear. They celebrate for a little bit, but unfortunately for them, the Van Buren administration, President Martin Van Buren of Seinfeld Van Buren Boys fame, he decides they're going to appeal this, and this case is going in front of the Supreme Court. If it wasn't already a big deal, now it was going to be something that really captured the attention of the American public. What's interesting is that at this point, everything kind of happened in the same way you would expect it to go down today. And what I mean by that is that the issue was immediately polarizing. So some people, depending on their political stance, mostly on slavery, some people depicted the Amistad slaves as heroes, and they're depicted in, royal kind of tones and postures, and this is because, slavery is a horrible thing, and the abolitionists and a lot of Christian groups would get together and support the slaves in that way, while the other side of the polarization would depict the Amistad slaves as barbaric pirates who were murderers and thieves, and depending on your political agenda, you kind of fell into one of two camps here. So the first group was the group that was kind of pro-slavery, and they depicted these Amistad slaves as pirates. So in those newspapers and those, theater dramas and plays and essays, the slaves would be depicted as kind of menacing people who'd committed murder, and they need to be brought to justice for killing the crew members on the Spanish slave ship. On the other side, you had kind of a combination of different abolitionist groups and Christian groups that kind of led the defense of the African slaves. The Christian folks were kind of looking to, quote-unquote, civilize the Africans, bring them into Western society. Most of these abolitionists were Christians, and it was important that they educate the slaves in as many ways as possible. So whether that be language or math or any type of education, they kind of became teachers. And the reason they did this is that the more these Amistad slaves learn, the more they can contribute to the case. So the more they can communicate, the more they can feel like they're part of this thing, they can contribute the facts and the details and the supporting evidence that they need to win in the Supreme Court. And of course, the Christian groups were looking to spread Christianity to people who hadn't before experienced it. So the Amistad Africans seemed to take favorably to Christianity, and you can kind of see in their writings, in their letters, in the way they acted, that they were kind of merging beliefs, or at least it seemed like it. So some of their African religious beliefs were kind of merged with Christianity as far as the way they talked about things. Some people think this might have been a matter of strategy. So, if these people are willing to help me, I'll believe whatever I need to believe, because my ultimate goal is to get myself home. So the argument on the pro-slavery side was that, listen, it's in the law. Okay, right now slavery is legal in the United States, in particular in the South. And furthermore, it would be chaotic if all of a sudden we declared that slaves aren't property anymore. That would unleash chaos all across the South, or so the pro-slavery people said. The argument for the abolitionists and the Christians was that, and the Amistad Africans themselves, most importantly, was that people have the right to resist tyranny and seize liberty if they're being oppressed. So, you remember when Patrick Henry said, "Give me liberty or give me death"? Well, here we go. Furthermore, the Amistad coalition argued, what's more important, legal rights or natural rights? It was Mark Twain that said, laws control the lesser man, right conduct controls the greater man. So their argument is that, look, I don't care what some treaty made 40 years ago says about the legality of slavery, or I don't care what this particular code in this particular state law says about slavery. These people's natural rights are clearly being violated. In America, everybody has the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that means that these people should not be treated as property. And this argument makes plenty of sense. So we all know plenty of laws that are just ridiculously absurd and made by flawed individuals looking to gain power or exploit a loophole or just due to a lack of intelligence. So just because it's a law doesn't mean we should be following it. What matters is doing the right thing. On February 22nd, 1841, almost a year after the initial ruling, the Supreme Court would convene to make their decision. Would the Amistad slaves be returned to their owners as property as part of this Pinckney Treaty of 1795, which stated that slaves in this situation should be returned to their owners? Or would the Supreme Court rule that the Amistad slaves were not property and would have the right to go free? The prosecution made a pretty simple opening argument in which they stated that this whole case was just a simple restoration of property. So slaves are property, the property was lost, it needs to be returned to the Spanish crew members who can then sail it back to where it came from in Cuba. And keep in mind, if that argument wins, then the Amistad slaves are going back to Cuba, and you better believe when they get back there, they're going to be executed, because rebellious slaves are not treated well by plantation-owning slave owners, obviously. So this really is life and death hanging in the balance for the Amistad slaves. After the opening statements of the prosecution, now came the time for the counter-argument from a guy by the name of Baldwin, who represented the Amistad slaves. And by all accounts, this was one of the most devastating and decisive arguments to ever be heard in front of the United States Supreme Court. First, he pointed out that, according to U.S. law, any citizen after 1820 that engages in the slave trade shall be known as a pirate. So, you want to talk about piracy and murder here? Who are the real pirates? Insinuating that the Spanish were the pirates. Baldwin would go on to say that the fact that they're in bondage at all is illegal according to that 1820 deal. So this means that they can't possibly be slaves because there's no slave trade. It's illegal. So they can't be property. Next, he addressed the issue of piracy, saying that these Amistad slaves had no goal of trying to get rich or seize other ships or capture other vessels or being pirates. They just wanted to go home. And it's clear from the accounts and the interviews that that was their goal the whole time, was to just go home. These clearly weren't pirates. Next, he argued that the Amistad slaves were actually free men when they showed up in the United States. So they weren't actually in conditions of slavery when they showed up. They were running the show. They were in charge of their own ship. So the United States government would actually have to re-enslave them and then trade them to the Spanish, which is not only unconstitutional, but illegal. Baldwin then also would make kind of this general principle of natural rights and the ideas of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, kind of a Enlightenment-style natural rights. And he would say that, look, You want to talk about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? Well, let's put our money where our mouth is and let's let these people go free. After this decisive argument was heard from Baldwin, the Amistad Slave Defense brought in their ace in the hole, former President John Quincy Adams. President Adams would speak for about 7.5 hours, getting very emotional, tears in his eyes at points, and he would systematically reinforce the argument that Baldwin had made before him. Adams was known as a relatively committed abolitionist, and it might have been possible that he just wanted to do the right thing and help these people. It also might have been possible that he was trying to score political points and, with a certain segment of the population, and he might have been trying to do both. After all of this arguing and after all of the arguments are heard, the Supreme Court, I think, makes what any sane individual would think is the right decision here, and they rule 7-1 in favor of the Amistad Africans. The court ruled that, in this case at least, these slaves were not anyone's property, but on the other hand, the United States government had no obligation for repatriation. So in other words, the government had no duty to actually get these people home. They were on their own now. They're free, yes, but they got to get home on their own. We're not going to help them. So the Amistad Africans are obviously able to rejoice and be happy because they've been freed, but they're also a little bit hesitant. First of all, the last time the local court made a decision, it was overturned. And secondly, they're not going to get any free trip home. So all of a sudden, they now have to raise money to go home and do what this whole rebellion was all about in the first place. Now they really have the opportunity to raise that money and go home. So the Christians and the abolitionists, in concert with the Amistad Africans, they make kind of a deal. So they're going to go on this tour all throughout different cities, and it's organized by the abolitionists and the Christians that they had allied with. And on this tour, they're going to basically perform all sorts of different things. So they would do like theater and athletic abilities, acrobatic type of stuff. Apparently a lot of these guys were really athletic and impressed people with backflips and stuff like that. And they also told the story of the rebellion in kind of a theatrical and impressive fashion. Many were actually critical of this tour because it seemed like the Amistad Africans and the people they were allied with were kind of making this too much of a show. They were taking something, obviously tragic and, making a little bit too much of a spectacle of it. But obviously the Africans had to do what they needed to do to get the money to go home. So to me, at least, it seems like a fair deal. The plan was to raise the funds, and then they'd be able to buy passage over back to Africa, where the Christian and the abolitionist alliance would set up a Christian mission back in Sierra Leone. From there, the Africans could continue to practice their new Christian faith, and the Christian missions could spread the gospel to people in Africa. Everybody wins. But unfortunately for at least one member of the Amistad Africans, this process of trying to go home was long, arduous, and overwhelming. Many months after the Supreme Court decision that freed the Amistad slaves, a former slave by the name of Fune was hit with what we would now call depression. He appeared to be, quote, lost in all activity of body and mind, and when asked about why he was feeling this way, he would say, quote, he was thinking about his mother, end quote. The prospect of not being able to see his mom again was obviously destroying Fune from the inside. Eventually, he would jump into a river and drown himself. Two former slaves that were close by went in to dive into the water and search for Fune and try and help him, but to no avail. One of the slaves who tried to help went by the name of Berna, and he was actually the guy who advocated for, way back at the beginning of the rebellion, treating the Spanish prisoners that they had taken, not killing them, trying to treat them at least somewhat decently. And this Berna guy really seemed to have a deep compassion for not just members of his own group, for really everybody in the story. So tragically, Fune would die drowning himself because he felt like he wanted to see his mom. And there's a kind of ancient belief that a lot of these Amistad Africans had, kind of a religious belief that when you die, you kind of go back home and you're reunited with your family and your friends. So we can't be sure why Fune decided to do it, but it might be just because he thought that's the only way to go be with his mother. After this incident, and about a year later, after the Supreme Court decision, the Amistad Africans would reverse the Middle Passage and finally make it to Sierra Leone on January 13th, 1842. It's difficult to say, kind of from a historical perspective, where they went from there. Some stayed in the area they landed, which was a place called Freetown. They kind of worked as workers. Some worked at the Christian mission, although not many ended up there. Most ended up actually going home to their friends and families. Sadly, some got caught up in the same slave wars that they had been caught up in before, and some were captured into another life of slavery or killed in these wars for slaves. But again, most of the Amistad Africans who made it back after 3 years of slavery just wanted to go home, and they did. Historian Marcus Rediker ends his book on the Amistad Rebellion describing the reunion that Berna had with his mother after all those years. Remember, Berna was a slave who pulled Fune out of the river and mourned for his friend who just wanted to see his mom. And here's Berna actually able to see his mom again. So they embrace. His mother's crying. Unbelievable that she's able to encounter her son again after all these years, not even knowing what happened to him, really. He was captured and never to be seen from again. Rediker describes that meeting by saying, quote, "After a considerable time, the mother began to sing the Sino, a song of welcome, as she and her long-lost son joyously rubbed the palms of their right hands in the traditional way. The cold, ruthless hand of slavery had been replaced by the tender warmth of the mother's palm. Berna, known for his strong feelings for his shipmates, probably thought of Fune, who on the other side of the Atlantic had so dearly longed to see his own mother." End quote. It's difficult to say what the long-term historical impact of the Amistad Rebellion was. It certainly did inspire future slave revolts like the Creole Rebellion, and it certainly did influence the thinking of the American public as they headed towards civil war. But ultimately, after years of slavery and torture and injustice, 35 out of 53 Amistad Africans, just like Berna, made it home. And that's a pretty incredible story.